Hi guys, and welcome to this video where we're going to begin our look at the Scotch Gambit. This is necessary really to cover in our overall coverage of the Italian, and the reason for this is because it can arise via a couple of different move orders, and so it would feel incomplete, our coverage, if we don't deal with the so-called Scotch Gambit. Let me put up on the board what that is. The first moves are pawn to e4, pawn to e5, knight to f3, and here, after knight to c6, generally speaking, how we're going to be dealing with the Scotch Gambit is via the move order of bishop to c4, and here, after the move knight to f6, then white will play the move pawn to d4, and after e takes d4, here white has a variety of options, but the move, for example, e5 enters mainline territory of the Scotch Gambit advanced variation, while the other moves that we're going to be dealing with are the somewhat dubious move knight to g5, this is called the Perreux Variation, and the more common move kingside castle, after which black has two major options here. The first option is bishop to c5, and here we will discuss the move pawn to e5, after which black's best bet is d5, and e takes f6 will take us into the very tricky, especially if we face it as black, the very tricky and very popular at the club levels, very popular Max Lang attack. While if, on the other hand, black, rather than playing the move bishop to c5 in order to defend the pawn, if on the other hand black grabs this second pawn that is being offered by white, this is known as the Scotch Gambit, the double gambit accepted, because black first took the pawn on d4 and then went ahead and took a second pawn on e4. And this is also a very tricky line. Now there's two more things to do for this introductory video. Before we talk about the Perreux variation, I want to just explain why the name the Scotch Gambit could arise out of this section where it seems like after the move, let me just place it on the board, after the move bishop to c4, now knight to f6, this is just the two knights defense in the Italian game, so why are we talking about the Scotch? Many of you will know that the Scotch game typically arises after the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and now white plays the move pawn to d4. This is what characterizes the Scotch game. The reason why we're covering it here under the Italian move order is that actually it can reach the exact same position, but by a thing called transposition. So in other words, by a different move order, but we can arrive at the exact same position. So here, for example, via the Scotch game move order, d4, black would capture the pawn on d4, and the mainline Scotch would involve white capturing the pawn on d4 back. But if white instead plays the move bishop to c4, then after the move knight to f6, here we've arrived at the exact same position as if white first plays bishop c4, black responds with knight f6, and then on the next move plays d4. Exact same position, different move order. We have to make a decision as to where we cover this material, whether we cover it here under the Italian move order or whether we cover it under a different repertoire for the Scotch move order, and we've chosen to cover it here. So this explains why this somewhat unusual name, and I hope that that clears things up. And other than that, let's discuss the Perreux variation. Okay, so the first variation that we're going to look at is the Perreux variation. This begins with the moves e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, or of course pawn to d4, we can arrive at the same position, bishop c4, knight to f6, pawn to d4, and here after e takes d4, white goes after the pawn on f7 with the move knight to g5. Now here in this position, black could play a move such as, for example, knight to e5 to defend f7. But for me, I think that the most problematic move to deal with, and therefore the one that we're going to focus on, is the move pawn to d5. I think that this is the best way to handle the Perreux variation, which objectively speaking is not very good. The idea is, of course, the bishop is cut off, black is improving his development, and white now captures the pawn on d5. This is more or less the only natural move. And black plays the difficult move to find if you don't know the theory, this move queen e7 check. I'm just going to show one game where, for example, black here played knight to e5 to show how even a strong grandmaster can get into trouble very, very fast. This is a game where white was an international master and black was a strong, I believe, Greek grandmaster. And the game continued knight e5, white played queen e2, pinning the knight. Black here made a big blunder with the move bishop to d6. White was able to play f4, and the knight on e5 was pinned and was lost. After the move bishop to g4, perhaps the grandmaster had expected that his position would be good because white would have to move the queen, and here would not be possible because of the attack on by the pawn, while the e4 square is covered by the knight. However, the grandmaster must have missed the move knight to f3. And here, even though black can capture on f3 and capture back on f3, white may have a ruined pawn structure for now, but what matters the most is that this knight on e5 cannot be saved. So already black had a lost position here. So let's go back and see how to avoid such early disasters. In this position, black, rather than playing with the move knight to e5, which is still a reasonable move if you play a little bit differently, if you don't play this bishop d6 move, but rather than this, the best move is queen e7 check. After queen e7 check, the point is that if white blocks with the queen, now we can actually take the queens off the board, and if white captures back with the bishop, the pawn on d5 will be falling. Black would be very happy and would in fact be up a pawn. So the natural choice is for white to recapture with the king. But now comes the move knight to b4 with a double attack on c2 and d5. And the complications work out in black's favor. So now we understand the logic behind queen e7. This check, because of concrete reasons, means that white doesn't have a good way to block. So white has to play king f1, and after this, the white king has lost his right to castle. Now and only now does black play the move knight e5 and attacking the bishop on c4. The pawn on d4 is now available to capture, so white's best move is to take the pawn. But now after knight takes c4, queen takes c4, the move pawn to h6, white's knight only really has the f3 square. The h3 square would allow black to capture the piece, and the e4 square is covered by both of black's knight and queen together. So white drops the knight back to f3, and now the final move that you need to know, black has the move queen to c5. The queen here on c4 is under attack, and the pawn on d5 is also under attack. White's best bet perhaps is to play queen e2, but black can simply block bishop e7, and the end of the line is just that black here has an attack of two pieces against the pawn on d5, and the move pawn to c4 here might seem to save the day, but the problem for white is that the bishop here is undefended and it's being x-rayed. So black actually can play the move b5, and here putting more pressure on the central pawns, undermining the base of the d5 pawn. Black's pieces are all in great shape, and he is simply much, much better than his white counterpart. The material is currently, in fact, in white's favor. White has an extra pawn, 7 against 6, but black will recover his pawn quickly, and in the meantime, white's king is very unsafe, and the entire center may collapse, and black also has the bishop pair and certainly a safer king. So that's it for this Perreux variation. You have to know how to react as black, But objectively speaking, I don't recommend it for white. And if you do know how to respond as black, then you will get at least equality, if not more. So hope to see you in the next video.